I like Zetsuen no Tempest, so I'm going to talk about it. But before I get into specifically why I like it and a somewhat comprehensive review of it, I'm going to have to put a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the show, watch it. I'm not going to give a description on the first few episodes of the show, as I know some people like to go in blind, and you can always go watch the abstract by yourself. But if you like Shinsekai Ori, Steins Gate, Erased, or Death Note, the genres of drama, mystery, or psychological shows in general, you'll probably have a pretty good time with Zetsuen no Tempest. With the obligatory spoiler warning out of the way, let's continue. Zetsuen no Tempest, or Blast of Tempest, or The Civilization Blaster, was a 24-episode anime that aired in the fall season of 2012, animated by Studio Bones, a pretty unknown studio, which really only has fame for very underground shows such as Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, Mob Psycho 100, and the even less well-known cult classic My Hero Academia. It's been a while since the show aired, and probably a while since many of you have watched it, so I'll go over a quick plot summary, but I'll try to be brief. Again, if you haven't watched it, go. Last warning. Also, skip to this timestamp if you already know the story or recently finished watching. Zetsuen no Tempest starts off its story in a Japanese beach town and introduces us to three characters right off the bat. Protagonist Yoshino Takigawa, a sweet-hearted but quiet and reserved boy who is often alone and without friends, especially when his best friend, the perfect foil, bombastic and brazen Mahiro Fuwa, leaves him a month before the start of the story. They all have an interesting relationship with Mahiro's adopted sister Aika Fuwa, who we later learn to be in a complicated love triangle where Mahiro doesn't realize he's in love with his sister, who his best friend is dating. Aika and Yoshino also decide it's a good idea to keep their relationship hidden from Mahiro. We also learn that Aika died about a year ago, and the killer has never been found. This is the event that drives much of the story as Mahiro swears vengeance on his sister's killer, and is to say, at least disappointed when the police can't find any leads. Hakaze Kusaribe is another character we are introduced to at the beginning of the show, being put on a magically hidden island somewhere in the Pacific through force. She briefly explains that it's because of a dispute within their clan, and she enlists the help of Mahiro to help her escape. Yoshino is going through the motions of a normal life, going to school, participating in his classes, and getting his money stolen by seniors older than him, where he runs into another curious character, Evangeline Yamamoto, or She questions him about stuff that Yoshino doesn't understand, such as something called Black Iron Disease, and about Mahiro, someone he hasn't seen in a long time and doesn't know the whereabouts of. Suddenly, a bunch of butterflies appear during winter when they're supposed to be in a chrysalis, and Mahiro appears out of the sky. He gets into a fight with Fräulein Yamamoto, beats her, and explains magic to Yoshino as they run away from the Fuwa family grave. The episode ends on a bit of a cliffhanger as a floating eye with some chains attached to it rises from the ocean and appears to threaten them and put them in some sort of danger. For the first episode, it's got a lot of stuff in it, and the pace up until the midway climax slows down. We learn a lot more about Aika and Yoshino's relationship, that they started dating, the exact relationship and love triangle involved, more about the world of magic, and we get introduced to some of the other characters from the Kusaribe clan, the main villains of the first half of the series. We also learn about the Tree of Genesis, which has been dormant for many years, but which is slowly regaining strength, and which gives the Kusaribe clan their power. There's also the Tree of Exodus, which opposes the Tree of Genesis and injured the Tree of Genesis sometime in the past. There was a schism in the leadership of the Kusaribe clan as to which tree they should support, and while the head of the clan, Hakaze, supported the Tree of Genesis, the rest of the clan supported the Tree of Exodus and usurped Hakaze. As for the other members of the Kusaribe clan, we have the cool dancer Natsumura, who Mahiro meets early and realizes he can't beat, Tetsuma, who bothers the boys in an aquarium when Yoshino is reflecting on things that Aika had told him on a date at this very aquarium, and Armin Arlert. I mean Junichiro Hoshimura, a non-mage who originally was an honorary member of the clan but has apparently decided to stay neutral, and who has a crippling addiction to huge boobs. The first half of the season climaxes in a showdown between the main baddie Samon, de facto leader of the Kusaribe clan after removing Hakaze from power. The main fight scene spans multiple episodes and is essentially a verbal showdown between Samon and Yoshino, trying to convince Mahiro, who has a talisman capable of irreversibly damaging or supporting a single side, to join their side. They find out that Hakaze is actually trapped 2 years in the past, and that her current self is dead, which means that it's impossible for Hakaze to stop the Tree of Exodus, and thus stopping the destruction of the world is impossible. They eventually figure out that it's possible to time travel using Hakaze's skeleton as an anchor point, but she is too late. The Tree of Genesis strikes at the Tree of Exodus, and the military who was attacking the Tree of Exodus takes major damage, and Yoshino and Mahiro die, although Hakaze and Samon work on fixing their wounds very quickly and are eventually able to save them. After episode 12, there is what I wouldn't say is a time skip, but certainly a refocus of what the show is about. Suddenly, about a month after we left off, 2 billion people around the world are dead, militaries have been reduced to dust, and crime is punished directly by the Tree of Genesis, which appears throughout the world. While the world is mostly peaceful, Aika's killer has not been discovered, and the main trio, which now includes Hakaze, who's become infatuated by Yoshino, want to change the world back, and more importantly, find out the truth about Aika's killer. They theorize about the existence of a Mage of Exodus, someone who would have been the parallel person to the Princess of Genesis, Hakaze. Different members of the group have different ideas on who the killer may be, but most involve finding out the identity of the Mage of Exodus. Samon, the other Kusaribe clan members, and Takumi Hayakawa, who was in the show earlier but I neglected to mention, he's a military leader of Japan in charge of dealing with magic, convince Mahiro that Yoshino is likely to be the Mage of Exodus and to keep an eye out on him. Eventually, they find Megumu Hanemura, who has magic derived from the Tree of Exodus and is very powerful, but does not have the willpower to kill anyone or do anything about the Tree of Genesis in his current state. So, training montage while Yoshino and Hakaze are doing their thing and exploring the world. Hakaze becomes increasingly worried that her love towards Yoshino will cause the Tree of Genesis to kill Yoshino's girlfriend, who at this point she believes to be alive, but outside of the current group. She tries to stop loving him, yet ultimately fails. She confesses to Yoshino that she thinks her love may kill his girlfriend, to which he finally admits his girlfriend has been dead for over a year, and that it was Aika. This only terrifies Hakaze more, as now she thinks that she's the one that killed Aika. Before they do anything else, everyone has to figure out who Yoshino's mysterious girlfriend is. After a bit, they determine it's Aika, Yoshino admits it's true, and him and Mahiro make up, as he doesn't see the point in fighting over someone who's dead. To prove who killed Aika once and for all, the group devises a plan for Hakaze to go back in the past, find Aika, and figure out who was the one that killed her. Mahiro is still dead set on revenge, and he says he'll kill anyone who did it, including his friend Yoshino and Hakaze, who both agree that if they were the ones who killed Aika, they deserve it. Hakaze figures out that Aika is the true Mage of Exodus, Yoshino has no connection to it, she doesn't know that she is dying tonight, and then Aika decides that only she could have killed herself. Aika commits suicide, but writes one last note and leaves a video for the boys to open after they overcome the thing that her death's purpose was. When they get back, everyone just kind of accepts it, and Mahiro decides that if Aika killed herself to get him to save the world, he better go through and do it. They force themselves onto the final mission, and we eventually take down the Tree of Genesis with Hanemura's help. They watch the message on the train where Aika says that both friends had a very positive effect on her life, but tells them that actors must not wantonly abandon their script which is set up for them. The series ends with Mahiro and Yoshino praying at the Fuwa family grave, Mahiro insistent that while Aika's death is not meaningless, he simply won't follow the script life has given him and will abandon it if it leads to tragedy. That was a bit longer of a recap than what I wanted, but at least I won't have to spend much time giving context to a lot of the scenes I'll be talking about, or at least the ones that don't need a lot of thinking. To start with my personal opinions on the show, I suppose I'll start with the story, as that's the thing that I just finished talking about. It's pretty good. The pacing is a bit odd, as the first episode has a lot of stuff happening in it, while the episodes that directly follow turn down the pace. I honestly enjoy the slower paced pacing, as I enjoyed spending more time in the depression and melancholic feelings that both Yoshino and Mahiro were facing. It at least felt that the plot was being sufficiently advanced despite the slow pacing, which is something I very much appreciate in anime. The pacing picked up again around episode 8 or 9, which is when the first climax happens, and they start building to what seems to be a battle, only for it to turn into a verbal smackdown to see who can convince Mahiro to join their side, either firing the talisman or not firing it. This I thought was very interesting to see in the show, that it didn't come to raw fighting ability or experience, something that Simone would probably best both in, but rather a loyal argument that kept my engagement for numerous episodes. Another thing that kept my interest is the plot twists, and there are a lot of them. Generally, a lot of plot twists is a sign of poor writing, or at the very least, the author not having an idea on where they want the story to go and stalling, but the plot twists in Zetsuen Tempest were very well thought out, and as far as I can tell, it makes sense in terms of the limited knowledge that the characters had at the time, and in the true story that happens at the end. For example, the knowledge of Hakaze's whereabouts, and specifically the fact that she's 2 years in the past, is kept secret from us for 9 episodes, but when it's finally revealed, it doesn't contradict anything that came before, or the system of magic that they've set up. Everything that's been shown to us previously in the story still functions under the knowledge that Hakaze is 2 years in the past. Then there are more twists with being related to Hakaze's island, such as Yoshino's spoof theory about being asleep for 2 years, which appears not to be disprovable, until Simone gets her to write a message on the barrel. This is again followed by a plot twist that Hakaze can get back since her voice is traveling through time, since the skeleton is the exact same place and same time and can be used as an anchor. It is again followed up by a twist that Simone knew this all along and had prepared a sacrifice that will give Hakaze the power she needs to teleport through time to get out of there. All of these twists are interesting, and when looking back, none seem odd or out of character for anyone who suggests certain things. In fact, having Hakaze's bones be brought up earlier in the story doesn't make sense until you understand this information, and then everything fits together. The characters originally don't think of this, because, let's be honest, when someone says that they know it's Hakaze's bones on instinct, are you really going to hypothesize that it's because the person you know is very much alive and talking to you right now has been dead for a year and a half? This continuity across most of the story's main beats is what really kept me interested in the story. Did it need to keep all of the plot twists to remain as interesting? Probably not, but this is a sign of good writing. If they knew Hakaze was 2 years stuck in the past from the beginning, would Mahiro not have continued with her? He probably would have, which is a sign of a compelling and interesting plot. One of the most important things in all of anime to me has to be the soundtrack. In fact, for a lot of my favorite shows, it's probably my most favorite aspect of it. If I had to rank the order of things I care about most in anime, it would probably go somewhat like this. I will put a disclaimer here that while I have direction as the least important aspect to me, I'm not saying the direction is useless. I'm near certain that the director's choice of camera angle and what a shot should look like has a great effect on the scene and what I get out of it, but I have next to no knowledge on what goes into being a director, so its choices go over my head, and thus I cannot discuss it. I'd love to learn more about how different shots affect the emotional impact or meaning of a scene, but it's not super high on my priority. Oh, another disclaimer about this list, something being over another doesn't mean it's more important in every show, just it's a very general look into what I pay attention to in a show. Having bad characters and a bad OST, but good everything else below it, doesn't automatically mean that the show is bad, despite my hierarchy suggesting that. With those disclaimers out of the way, I'd like to discuss the other aspects of Zetsuen and Tempest in the order of importance that I just laid out, starting with the soundtrack. Frankly, it's amazing. I love classical music. Its use of instruments, especially focusing on the strings, with some songs focusing on other instruments, makes everything fresh, and the lack of vocals keeps my attention on the scene instead of the music when it needs to. Like most anime, the soundtrack also uses themes as one of the ways of getting across emotional concepts, and the theme that does this best is Aika's theme. Hearing the harp start out and go to the oboe is instantly recognizable as any time when Aika is talking. I can almost hear her distinct voice and cadence when the song is played on its own, which goes to show that the amazing composition of the soundtrack. Even on the first hearing, before learning that Aika had died and way before we learned that she isn't ever coming back, the song sounds very melancholic with a bit of an uplifting feeling sprinkled into it. The song doesn't change throughout the series in terms of composition, but the emotional weight that the song carries does based on the story, eventually culminating to a bittersweet song at the very end when Aika reveals that she is truly dead, but enjoyed every moment of her life because of Yoshino and Mahiro. When I was first watching the series and listening to the soundtrack for the first time, it reminded me a lot of a Kaijura soundtrack to the heavy classical influence, but it's actually Mario Odaka as the composer, who also composed the original Fate Stay Night, Gossek, and Kanan soundtrack. Apparently some of the songs in the anime are also Beethoven, which makes sense, as he did compose certain tracks derived from Shakespeare's The Tempest and Hamlet, which Zetsuen no Tempest takes a lot of inspiration from. The main theme, or Yoshino's theme, is also very good and recognizable, and the battle theme sends a strike of urgency and epicness into all the battles they accompany. There is a heavy use of violins and cellos in the orchestra, while only having a few songs which feature brass, but this makes sense. Odaka is going for an early classical theme in her music, which never really had too many brass instruments, and so the battle themes that use them keep the OST fresh with a unique sound across all of its songs. No two songs sound similar, despite multiple characters having multiple themes which portray similar emotions and elicit like responses. The openings and endings of a show rarely add too much to the scale of negative or positive of the show, and I think that remains true with Zetsuen no Tempest. Opening 1 is a bit boring in my opinion, sung all in English, and while recognizable, it doesn't have much of an impact on the show it precedes. The first ending, on the other hand, is pretty good, and its upbeat theme is an ironically sad contrast to the depressing end of episodes in the first half, especially on the episodes that focus on Aika at the end, or Yoshino's responses to her sudden passing. The second half of the show switches this up a bit, having a better opening than ending, and while they are both passable, none really stick out to me as an amazing piece of music, or one that I want to listen to more than would normally come up on a shuffle in a playlist. I would take mediocre openings and endings for an amazing soundtrack, so needless to say, I'm still very happy with the music in Zetsuen no Tempest. For this next section, I'm going to combine characters and character dynamics because they're very interlinked with each other. I also want to end on a positive note, so I'll roughly be discussing the characters in terms of the one I like the least, and ending with the ones I like the most. Zetsuen no Tempest has some pretty well written characters, and while at first some characters like Hakaze, Natsumura, or Mahiro might seem cliche, this feeling quickly goes away as the story progresses and the characters get more development. The first character I want to talk about is one of the four main characters, that being Hakaze. I must admit, I don't particularly like her character. She's the eye-catcher token waifu of the series, appearing scantily clad or flat out naked for much of the series, and while she has a lot more depth than some of the other characters that fit into this role in other series, I still can't bring myself to actively like her. She has her strong aspects, such as her story of being a bratty and self-glorifying princess, acting much like stereotypical royalty, but eventually learning that her side is wrong, and in the last part of the show coming to the conviction that the Tree of Genesis might be fully evil, and that if it killed Aika, she will fiercely punish or destroy it. The relationship between Hakaze and Yoshino is a bit of a mixed bag. I love the implication that Hakaze never had much of a social life before, and since Yoshino is the first male in years that has been strong and willing to protect her, she falls for him and is infatuated. While I thought this was a very interesting idea, I feel that it lasted a bit too long, and Hakaze's actions were really bordering on an idiot plot until about episode 18, when Yoshino finally reveals his girlfriend was actually Aika, who's been dead. The things I liked most about Zetsuen no Tempest were the slower and more depressing parts of it. Discussions of grief, handling grief, and moving forward in a world where your only motivation is disappeared, so I feel it's natural for me not to like a comedic relief character that much. Another disclaimer, I know that Hakaze isn't a comedic relief character, but a lot of her actions that I'm complaining about follow the actions that a comedic relief character would make, so I use the term. Don't take it too seriously. She also does not change very much when interacting with the characters. Only Simone and Yoshino appear to have much of an impact on her actions. It needs to be noted, however, that this isn't a sign of bad writing. She's meant to act this way, but it is in a way that I don't necessarily enjoy. I'm content with her at the end of the story, however, despite still being in love with Yoshino. She at least respects his boundaries more and isn't over the top as she was just a few episodes before, and Yoshino still rejects her, which is something that the anime doesn't show off, but I wish they did. The salt in the wound, however, was the scene where she goes in the past and talks with Aika about her murder that is supposed to happen on that night. I'll talk some more about Aika a bit later, but Hakaze refusing to talk with Aika instead of deciding that a head-on fight with someone she can't win against is the best course of action with very little time left is one of my least favorite actions of the show. It advances one of the messages of the show, that fighting people ultimately leads nowhere and that the most pressing problems are solved through communication, but Hakaze's actions directly lead to the removal of any option that there was for Aika to survive, which I was rooting for to happen. Don't know how I wanted her to survive, but man, I still wish Aika was around, and while it's on Hakaze's character to mess up the chances of that happening, it still rubbed me the wrong way. Of the characters that have a reasonable amount of screen time, she's my least favorite, but I wouldn't call her bad. I'm going to combine Tetsuma and Natsumura in one section here, as for all intents and purposes, they're very similar characters. They have very little character development within the bounds of the story, but more of the character is revealed throughout the story, which keeps their character fresh. While I didn't like the overt comedic relief of Hakaze, the deadpan humor that the Kusuribe clan males bring to the table is a welcome break from the otherwise serious nature of the show. I think that the characters fit fairly well into the world, and aren't grossly overpowered or obscenely underpowered, and they give good backdrop for Yoshino and Mahiro to show off their intelligence without the opponents being ridiculously dumb. I'm fairly satisfied with how Natsumura and Tetsuma end in the series, both still serving the Kusuribe clan and appear happy with their jobs. They don't do things that seem out of character from the characters we've learned about in these last few episodes, and that's refreshing to see in a mostly lighthearted ending. Simone is also a very interesting character, and we are introduced to him as the ultimate villain in the series. Cunning, incredibly patient, and ruthless in his methods. After all, the entire premise for Hakaze getting back was that she is the only one who could stop the Tree of Exodus if it got out of control, and Simone is not the type to take chances. Thus, there must be a way to get her off the island. Before the big reveal that this is true, he's also shown to have collected Hakaze's skeleton, which we learned to be the actual real skeleton of her, which paints an even grimmer picture of Simone. But of course, this first climax is not where the series ends, and Simone changes his allegiances. To me, this doesn't go against his character, as the entire premise of a cold and calculating leader is still mostly true. But it was artificially blown up by the stories of Hakaze and the early incompetence of Mahiro in fighting the other Kusuribe clan members that increased the perceived prowess of Simone. His debate in the first climax is also within his character that we have learned so far. All he needs is to wait for the name of someone who murdered a year ago, which the mage stronger than him is already confirmed to be from the Kusuribe clan. Mahiro only has to fire the talisman one time to force him to retrieve Hakaze from the past, so stalling in a purely verbal debate is advantageous to him. Yoshino, who I will talk about in a bit, also sees it as advantageous to get Mahiro to fire the talisman and then not fire the talisman when events change, and this infuriates Simone, which forces him to break the mirage of a perfect and calculated villain numerous times. In his second half self, he still acts cold and calculated, but with the knowledge that he's been bested only a month ago by some children, so he is humbled. He is convinced that Yoshino is the Mage of Exodus, which eventually turns out to be false, but his deduction skills in coming up with the conclusion match the character that has been set up around him, and it is an interesting theory that makes many of the characters seriously considered to be true right up until the end. Simone's end is a bit mediocre. The anime really doesn't show Yamamoto's advances towards him and leaves him in a bit of a weird state. Sure, he was proven right about the original conflict of Exodus versus Genesis, but he's mostly forgotten about in the celebrations, and other characters have come to take the spotlight. The way I'm phrasing this makes it seem like I'm disappointed with Simone's character arc, but I'm actually pretty satisfied with it. While he doesn't have a lot of screen time in the final fight, his actions before and the small closure he gets in the ending episode was good enough for me. The shift that occurs in the middle of the story did a good enough job of unburdening Simone from needing to be the main villain anymore, so the focus wasn't needed to make his arc feel complete and fulfilling. Moving on to another comedic relief character, Fräulein Yamamoto. I'll keep most of this quick as I already talked about my opinions on the comedy in Zetsuen no Tempest, but it may surprise you to learn that I liked her more than Hakaze in the comedy department. That being said, her character doesn't really do much besides comedy and maybe one or two fights, and I think if you look at her as a focus character, you won't get much out of her. However, I have to admit that she's got a lot less screen time than some of the other characters, and because of this, I can forgive her not having too much development. Her end is similar to Simone. I wish the anime had at least a bit of a more obvious hint that they were invested in each other. Why aren't you paying attention after talking about how she's ready to be in a relationship to Natsumura and Simone wasn't a great hint, but overall, pretty alright character. Armin Allert, wait, I already made this joke. Junichiro is next, and once again, comedic relief. That being said, unlike Yamamoto, he actually has importance to the story and depth besides I like boobs. I quite like Junichiro, a character with no magic who is still feared by mages because of his expertise in dealing with them, is a very interesting person to have around. His dynamics with the various characters in the show paints him as a much more deep and complex character than he shows off himself, and this is interesting. On the outside, he looks just like a slightly weird perv. He has the knowledge of magic, is trusted with holding onto a very powerful talisman, and goes toe-to-toe with Natsumura in a fight, which at the time is the strongest character we've been introduced to. His conviction to stay neutral may seem a bit confusing, as he eventually does join sides with humanity, but remember that Junichiro only wanted to be neutral in the Kusuribe feud, not necessarily everything. Once the Kusuribe are back together and cooperating, he joins them and acts as someone who trains Hanimura, again staying out of the fighting directly, but still influencing a lot from the background. I wouldn't say he's one of my favorite characters, but he's well written and his interactions with the other cast members are always entertaining to watch. They respect him, insult him, fight him in futility. You can make guesses but never know, and these interactions help other people in the series be characterized more by how they interact with someone so cavalier. Hanimura is a character I'm going to cover quickly. While his character is a bit annoying and over the top, especially in his refusal to hurt anything, he's still a well-written character, and I have to say I enjoyed his development throughout the second half of the series. Being the quickly brought up Mage of Exodus makes sense as to why he acts the way he does, and him instantly getting back together with his girlfriend at the end of the series doesn't bother me either. The sword that he eventually defeats the Tree of Genesis with at the end of the movie and saves him is a bit contrived, I have to admit, but this is more of an issue with the plot than the characters. Overall, watching him grow through interacting and getting directly trained with the other characters in the story was very satisfying, and Hanimura is probably my favorite side character in the whole series. Finally, we're at the juicy part of the characters, the main characters. I really enjoy all of them a lot, so let's start with Mahiro. He's introduced to the audience as a bad boy, the kind of person to always skip school and get into fights, and we of course believe this. However, we learn very quickly that he's only started acting as a deviant about a year ago, when his sister died to burglars and the police have no way of determining who the killer is. This infuriates Mahiro as he swears to kill whoever murders his sister. As motivation, this is something that almost everyone can relate to. Mortality is perhaps the only constant that all humans can relate to, and while not everyone can relate to murder in particular, and not everyone's gonna go swear vengeance on whoever killed their family member, the audience can still at least understand the emotions that Mahiro is going through. I would call Yoshino and Mahiro foils, but not direct opposites, even at the beginning when they have a lot of traits that are in opposition of the other's goals and ideals. They do share similar traits and motivations, but I would like to point out that it is their differences that drive a lot of the plot. They both try to hide their sadness over Aika's death, but do it in different ways. Mahiro becomes very angry and decides that he will kill the person who killed Aika, where Yoshino hides his feelings from everyone because he focuses on others over himself. Mahiro and Yoshino are also very similar in the fact that they want to save the world, but the reasoning behind it changes a bit between them. Mahiro is willing to sacrifice the world if it means he can avenge Aika, while Yoshino looks for the solution where both can be saved. As the story progresses, Mahiro gradually learns more and more that killing the person who murdered Aika is less and less important, and both him and Yoshino move through the grief cycle, eventually ending up at acceptance by the end of the movie. Mahiro is also interesting in the fact that he rejects things that are logical, yet many of the decisions made by him throughout the movie are illogical or affected by illogical actions of others around him. Think of the climax argument between Yoshino and Samo and with Mahiro in the middle. Yoshino had no logical reason to believe that Aika's death had any meaning at all, but a seemingly throwaway line about how everything in this world has a meaning gets him to try and fight for Hakase's life, and thus change Mahiro's action and the fate of the world. Eventually, he comes to pray at Aika's grave, something that he originally threw away as illogical and wasting time. After all, the dead are dead, and there's nothing the living can do to make them hear us or make them come back to life. Which brings me to the biggest illogical action that Mahiro commits, his desire to murder Aika's killer. In real terms, killing the murderer with his own hands does nothing. The murderer would still receive a very strict punishment if he was apprehended by authorities. It would likely not make Mahiro feel any better, despite constantly telling himself that is what he wants and what will make him feel better, and the most important thing, it will actually not bring Aika back to life. Yet, he still pursues this goal of wanting to kill Aika's murderer all the way up until he physically cannot anymore at the revelation that Aika killed herself to get Mahiro and Yoshino closer to saving the world. I'm incredibly satisfied with Mahiro's ending, going from a snobby rich boy who didn't care about anyone or anything in the world to one who will try and better the world through hard work and determination, and claiming that he will not live his life by a script as Aika wants him to. The labeling of Aika as wrong in this issue shows massive character growth in Mahiro, as he would not have dared say anything so bold about Aika before his journey. He's my third favorite character in the series. Well, we may as well do a top 3 list, and the next is Yoshino, my second favorite character. Being the main character in a story-driven show, he better be well written and have some interesting development. And I have some good news. He exceeded my expectations. He starts off as a relatively quiet boy that doesn't really fit the mold of a singular trope. He acts kind and nice to everyone, but is disappointed when he can't win a fight against 3 people older than him, and instead wishing Mahiro was around that they could beat up the bullies together and get his wallet back. He claims to be interested in saving the world, but we find out somewhat early on that he's doing this mostly for Aika. While he wouldn't sacrifice the world for Aika as Mahiro would, he still does a lot of the things in the show because this is what Aika would have wanted him to do. The biggest example is one I shared earlier about fighting for Hakase during the first climax because of Aika's remarks, but there's also keeping Aika and Yoshino's relationship from Mahiro, and the idea of saving the world is somewhat her idea as well. Needless to say, Yoshino is a very complex character that only gets better as the series progresses. We eventually learn that he's been carrying the weight of his girlfriend's death alone the entire time, unable to talk to even his best friend about it. He isn't the perfect human either. He has real flaws that make him act in a way that appears realistic. As a kid, he didn't want to interact with Mahiro because of his pompous attitude, where the perfect character would be jumping at the opportunity to help others. He doesn't help solve Mahiro's case about the biker running him over out of the goodness of his heart, but it's partially motivated by the desire to get away from him as soon as possible. As mentioned before, he doesn't want to save the world because that is his ultimate ideal, but because he still thinks that there's some way to save Aika by going along with his wild journey. These flaws make him a likable and relatable character, and I actually cheered his growth throughout the series as I watched him overcome some of his greatest flaws. His dynamics with the other characters were always interesting to see as well. He rarely shows emotion, something that has kept his relationship with Aika a secret from everyone and has improved tremendously through hiding the effect of her death on him. When he talks with anyone about his feelings towards Aika in their totality, he always says it in sort of an accepting tone and a look of his eyes that he may never be truly happy again, culminating in his reveal to Hakase and soon everyone about the true nature of his girlfriend. The first time he cried about it was with Hakase after she continued asking him about his girlfriend, and it is a very emotional scene that shows off the importance of processing events illogically, despite nothing of value coming from crying or getting mad. The most important conflict that I think Yoshino overcame was finally telling Mahiro about the relationship with his sister and the only person he ever loved. Mahiro took it quite well, and I think a large part of that is Yoshino's character. He doesn't show regret in dating her and is very honest about their relationship, and although Mahiro basically knows who Yoshino's girlfriend was, Yoshino still admits everything first with basically no pressure from Mahiro. Yoshino's end is probably the one I enjoyed the most. He finally accepts that Aika truly did die and that there's no saving her, and agrees with Mahiro that one shouldn't live life by a script if it means their own downfall. While not displayed directly in the anime, he stays faithful to Aika, proving true her statement that she was the only one who could possibly love him and he was the only one who could possibly love her. Just to quickly clarify something, the anime doesn't actually contradict the extended ending in the manga, so I'm considering both as canon. His reaction to the final speech that was recorded by Aika produces expected results, with him finally being at rest about her death and able to move on. I think that if the series continued, I could very accurately predict that Yoshino will remain Aika's boyfriend forever, proving Mahiro's comment that Yoshino may one day forget you because he can always get another girlfriend false. And I think the ability to make such a confident prediction in the main story just shows how great the characterization and writing in Zetsuen no Tempest is. Well, you've probably been expecting it, so it's time to talk about it. My favorite character in this series, Aika Fuwa. It feels a bit odd that my favorite character is someone who is dead for literally the entire series, but her flashbacks add so much character to her. We can see the influence she left on Mahiro and Yoshino in the way that they act and talk about her, even a year past her death. She has this mixture of childish prose and a very sophisticated way of articulating herself, along with appearing incredibly smart, and all of this combines to create one of the most interesting characters in anime. Her strength as a character doesn't come from development throughout the story either, as she's dead throughout the entire thing and everything has already happened. Her entire characterization becomes complete at the start of the story, and it's so strong that she becomes the best character in the series. All of her character growth is given in flashbacks, and there's always a different dynamic being put on display, and sometimes multiple. Is the story focusing on Yoshino's love life? Then the flashback will probably focus on highlighting a facet of his personality that either caused a problem with Aika or how he got that personality trait by being around her. Her abrasive nature towards everything around her, including both Yoshino and Mahiro, is never to be taken very seriously, and she's really only cold in her spat with Hakase, which makes any scene with her in it all the more enjoyable. This, of course, brings us to the whole time travel episode where Hakase goes into the past to stop Aika from being murdered, only to find out that she's the one that killed herself in the first place. This is the scene that I have the most mixed feelings about, but I think that's a good thing. From a purely writing perspective, this is a very good twist. It doesn't make sense for any other person to kill Aika, and her being a mage of Exodus explains her odd actions. Her staying dead is also a way to make her effect on the characters feel more permanent. There wasn't some super easy answer to the grief, such as surprise, she's actually alive, or a slightly rare but more cliche, she's an AI now, so she basically still exists. Not killing herself would have also messed up the timeline and not guaranteed that Yoshino and Mahiro ended up on the same path to save the world, something that Aika only sees as happening if the events play out in the exact same way as they did previously. I do put some of the blame on Hakase, as I have already stated in her section. I think that if she was more calm and tried talking it through, a different conclusion could have been met, which would satisfy my emotional desire to see Aika alive. At this point in the series, Aika had become far and away my favorite female in the show, and the illogical side of me wanted to see her come back. A part of me wishes they did the Steins Gates approach, where, spoilers for the end of Steins Gate, skip here to avoid them, Okabe faked Kurisu's death, but makes it appear to his past self and the world that she has actually died. Obviously, Hakase couldn't have transferred Aika into the future, and there would have had to have been some way of hiding her for 2 years, but the story could have accommodated that. The video she left could have explained this and where to find her. Another way that they could have done it is Aika survives but knows that Mahiro and Yoshino have to save the world, so she guides them into doing it, knowing knowledge from the future, but this would have necessitated a much longer runtime than the show had left, and this was always going to be far less likely option than the other one. Her permanent death does leave an air of bittersweetness to the ending, in that Yoshino will never feel fully complete again despite totally accepting her death, and Mahiro having to live through losing a family member that he was in love with no respite for his yearling quest for vengeance. But this is, as I previously mentioned, good writing. It's simply childish and selfish for me to have my cake and eat it too. But hey, I'm human. I'm allowed to wish. Yoshino and Mahiro will always keep part of her alive in themselves, and this is the best we can wish for. Not to say that the other aspects of the show were bad in any such capacity, but I'll not be covering the other topics in nearly as much detail as I did for the plot, characters, and music, as those are the three strongest pillars of Zetsuen no Tempest. I'll be briefly touching on some of the other aspects of the show that I thought were good or worth mentioning. On the world building side, the magic system follows a very loose system. While it is explained that it can only be used for repairing the logic of the world, we also see drastically increased speed and a form of offense that works around these restrictions, so it's not a hard and fast rule. Genesis magic is only for defense. The entire reveal that Hakase is in the past is kept secret because we don't know the full potential of magic. They can reach to the past and talk to dead people because there's no way to talk to them in the present. The Mage of Exodus magic prowess is mostly kept secret to make us think that Hakase has the upper hand, only for our expectations to be subverted when Aika wipes the floor with Hakase in their fight. I have no problems with a loose magic system as such as these, and no past or future actions ever contradict what we are being told in the present about the ability of magic, and all the examples listed above, plus any I didn't, are used to advance the plot in a meaningful way, which makes the loose magic system fit. The only real complaint I have for world building is the origins of the Tree of Genesis and Exodus. The story gives us nothing more than theories, and then they cut out the part of the manga where the theories are proven right, meaning that for a majority of viewers, they're just left with what amounts to a conspiracy theory and no real explanation for the tree's existence. For a 2012 anime, the animation is pretty solid. Of course, it's not on the level of Kyoto Animation, Mappa, or Ufotable, but it's bones. They do great work even if it's not the figurative cream of the crop. The fight scenes can feel a bit short at times, but they do their job, and the choreography and music all come together to create meaningful and impactful fights wherever they are necessary. A big part of what makes the characters stand out is their voice actors. I would hesitate to call any voice acting job done in Japanese bad in any work, and Zetsuen no Tempest is no exception. All of the characters have their own distinct tone and cadence, and all have a wide range of emotions they go through. The most prominent example of this is Aika, whose unique voice and cadence makes her unique character stand out even more. Way back in the music section, I mentioned how Aika's theme makes me immediately hear Aika talking along with the music. I think this is very much because of her unique voice. I can't exactly describe it more eloquently than I've already tried, but there's something special about her soft yet crisp voice talking to, scolding, or comforting Yoshino while her theme plays that just makes me feel warm and cozy inside. The visuals and art style was fine, it's just a typical anime style, nothing super unique or crazy that makes it stand out, and this is fine. Not everything needs a special art style or crazy visuals to stand out, and Zetsuen no Tempest already does a fine job in other departments that it isn't a detriment when Zetsuen no Tempest isn't in its unique art style. The character designs also fall into this. While some are unique, such as Yoshino's hair clips and Mahiro's jacket, they're not particularly odd or eye-catching. You could totally see someone looking like these characters in real life. The last thing I'd like to bring attention to is the background design, but once again, it's nothing too special. Just some Japanese coastal cities with a sea in the background, some forests, and an island to top it all off. Just as in the art section, it doesn't need super unique or fresh take on background design to be a good show, and makes you focus on other areas of the show instead. Overall, the show has many things that are outstanding, while other aspects are mediocre. I don't find issues with these mediocre aspects, however, as the amazing aspects far overshadow the importance of the smaller ones. Before I conclude the video, I'd like to address some common complaints and community feedback and examine why they aren't a problem or are a problem with the show and simply didn't affect my enjoyment of it. If I didn't discuss what you think is glaring negative with the show earlier, I might be covering it here, as I didn't want to repeat myself much throughout the video. The most common complaint I've seen about Zetsuen no Tempest is its inconsistent pacing. I alluded to this earlier, but the pacing in the show is inconsistent, being incredibly fast during the first episode, cramming a lot of information into a single 22-minute slot, and then slows down a bit until about episode 7 or 8 when the first climax starts. The second half of the show is a bit more medium paced, and I don't think there was nearly as much of an inconsistency, so I'm going to address the first half pacing. To be honest, I agree somewhat. Obviously, the pacing is a bit wonky and inconsistent, and I think the biggest problem is with the first episode. It tries to cast as wide of a net as possible, setting up a lot of problem threads and introducing no less than 3 problems within the same episode and trying to temporarily resolve 2 of them. The cliffhanger ending of the fruit appearing at the end of the very first episode almost turned me off, as I thought they were going to get into another big fight, but the start of the next episode immediately shows them fine as the eye floats away. I think the best way to rectify this is take the first 3 episodes, combine them into one, and then redistribute the plot elements equally between them, making 3 episodes again. Then, the same amount of content that gets covered originally in the first 3 episodes is still covered in those same, while easing the slowing down of the pace that is all too abrupt between episode 1 and 2. Despite this inconsistent pacing, however, this has hardly affected my enjoyment of the show. I'm very picky with the shows I watch, so the ones I do pick up, I almost always finish and very often enjoy, so I decided to continue, and I love the pacing of the next few episodes. Some people may not like the slow crawl towards understanding the world and basically putting the overarching plot of saving Hakase on the back burner for a while, but I enjoyed the slow entry to the world. If you didn't enjoy that, I'm sorry for you, that's just a personal preference, but at least the show picks up around episode 7. The second most common complaint I've seen is the cliche complaint, and I have to be honest with you, I didn't feel this one at all. First off, the show takes a lot of its plot and inspiration from 2 Shakespeare works, Hamlet and The Tempest. Did you honestly expect to see completely new characters in a show based off the works of a person who redefined the modern tragedy? I want to go on a quick tangent here to say that while my Shakespeare knowledge isn't amazing or pristine in any way, I have read Hamlet, and it's my favorite work that I've read from Shakespeare. I've not read The Tempest, and I'm sure it's very similar to Hamlet in quality. It was basically predetermined that I would like a show based off my favorite Shakespeare work, and what do you know, I do. Now back on the topic of cliche. Another reason the show called Cliché Story or Cliché Character doesn't really stick with me, if I'm being upfront, is that I haven't seen many anime. To someone who's seen 1,000 different shows, many characters are going to seem recycled and even copied from other shows, whereas someone who's only watched 100 shows wouldn't have the experience of watching tenfold the amount of shows, and thus only have 1/10 of the knowledge of character tropes and archetypes. Ultimately, the argument of cliché will only affect me in run-of-the-mill built-for-consumer isekai that the current seasons are spitting out, and won't affect my enjoyment for other genres for quite some time. I've also seen some complaints about the use of Shakespeare throughout the show, from the tone-deaf "it's unnecessary" to the more understandable "it makes the show seem pseudo-intellectual when it's just trying too hard to be." And this is one problem that I didn't see as a problem, though, and I think the people who make this complaint are wrong. First off, the only characters in the series that quote Shakespeare are Aika, Yoshino, and Mahiro. Yoshino and Mahiro get this habit from Aika, which is just another way of showing how much of an effect she had on their lives. Plus, the show is based off 2 very famous Shakespeare works, so in combination with the fact that Aika is the one who instigated this quoting, it makes sense that the characters would quote from it a lot. Also, and this applies specifically to Yoshino and Aika, they often quote it when looking for solutions. It's sort of a meta joke that they find themselves in the exact same predicament that is portrayed in the plays, but as Aika and Yoshino quote parts of these works, they're looking for solutions that the characters within the plays used and trying to apply those solutions to their current predicaments. Needless to say, I don't find any issue with the widespread use of Shakespeare quotes throughout the show, and I in fact think it heightened the experience, giving another thing that makes the main trio closer together. The last big complaint I've seen is CGI, and come on, it's 2012. The CGI doesn't look anything as bad as the Berserk CGI or the recent X-Arm Affront to God, and it's really only used in scarce few times throughout the series. The animation quality makes up for this, and it's not hard to ignore the CGI, especially when the camera pans away after only 10 seconds. I have to admit, it's a very small annoyance, but that's all it is. It hardly counts against the enjoyment I got out of Zetsuen no Tempest, and it shouldn't count against your experience either. The last night I'm going to cover is a complaint of the specific storytelling of Zetsuen no Tempest. That being the aspect of showing and not telling when dealing with the 2 billion people that die because of the Tree of Genesis. Some people have lodged complaints that they skip over a lot of impact of the Tree of Genesis. After all, it did drastically alter the world and kill almost a third of the world, meaning that people's family members and loved ones have passed away. At first glance, it seems a bit odd that the show doesn't spend time discussing this, but when looking deeper, we realize it does. There's an entire section dedicated to discussing this, where Yoshino and Hakaze are talking about how people don't seem to care that the deadliest event in human history has just happened, and that they're continuing with their lives. This parallels what happened in real history as well, where the war and diseases and poverty are always occurring, but people go happy and blissfully unaware of the sadness around them through their day. This is one of the secondary messages that the story makes in the second half of the series. People don't want a change from the status quo, even if it means returning to a life that they once had enjoyed. Once people are in the routine of the new, it's hard to get people to go back. This is contrasted by Mahiro's desire to save the world through any means possible and further explored through broader themes about ideals throughout the series. Should you care about the world if it negatively impacts you or the people closest to you? Mahiro seems to think no, but eventually comes to take Yoshino's stance on the issue, where achieving both is the ideal and sacrificing either to save the other is just as much of a tragedy than losing both. That's about all I got for, what did I call it, a somewhat comprehensive review and explanation of why I like the show. Did I miss anything important? Was there a positive I neglected to talk about enough, or talk about at all? A glaring flaw I didn't notice, or expunged from my memory? I'd love to continue talking about shows I like, including Zetsuen and Tempest. Is there a show you want me to watch and make a review of next? I'd love to do one of these for something like Fate or Darling in the Franxx, which, spoiler alert, I thought was very enjoyable and quite liked, but every plot point and dialogue line isn't as fresh in my mind, so it might not be as long. Maybe leave your thoughts about these shows or other things you want me to cover in the comments. If there's enough complaints, it might go in the community response section of the respective show's video. If you made it to the end of my monologue, I had to thank you. As I said earlier, I'd love to talk more about the things I like, and talking to an audience that doesn't listen isn't as fun as talking to one that watches the whole video through. This conclusion isn't long enough, and that's all I got for today. Get your friends to go watch Zetsuen no Tempest.
雪